This is Chapter 2 of the Marriage and Family course, talking about how and why we study marriages and families. I'm going to touch on a few things that the book doesn't really get into too much detail, such as the scientific method, because it's extremely important. As far as preparing for research, this chapter is also going to be very helpful for you for your paper assignment, because the paper topic, once that is selected and approved, then you will be writing an objective analysis about that topic. So objectivity is very important. That's suspending your beliefs, your biases, your prejudices, your opinions, and the barriers that prevent us from learning. We want to be analytical, critical analysis, objective in our learning about that topic. Another concept, the researcher does not allow his or her personal feelings to influence the interpretation of the data. So we can gather as much data as we want, but we still have to use sound scientific methods to interpret that data without our own values or feelings affecting that. Now, this is difficult for us to do. This is why college is hard. Learning is hard in general. This is difficult on our brains. Our brains did not evolve to work this way. Our minds are adapted to a world that no longer exists, prone to misunderstandings, correctable only by arduous education. We spent about 5+ million years evolving in small bands of hunter-gatherers, where basically what we did was survive and reproduce. The best way that I can explain this is through our System 1 thinking versus our System 2 level thinking. System 1 thinking is basically what we use to function on most of the time. It's based on our intuition, which is extremely important to us, helps us to survive. And when it's important to our survival, what has been the common thing for us to do for several million years while we were becoming humans is that we're driven by our emotions, our beliefs, our perceptions. And today it's even more based on our opinions of our beliefs. But back in the early days, before we were modern humans, when we would see a danger, we would react to it to survive, the fight or flight syndrome. Nowadays, when we see threatening information, we kind of react the same way. Our opinions kicked in and we either reject it or put our own interpretations on it. So this is why System 2 thinking is difficult. We have to really train our brains to use reason, logic, calculation, introspection. System 2 thinking is when we put in the conscious effort to understand something rather than just react with our emotions and our beliefs and our perceptions. So this is why learning is generally difficult for humans, because it's not natural to our brains. We actually have to work at it and requires conscious effort to kick our brains up there into that System 2 level to use reason, logic, to learn about it. As a result, we tend to discount science, particularly science that threatens our long-standing beliefs or long-held perceptions. And even if you go through the education process, that may not necessarily change your views of the world, your beliefs. If you've been socialized into a particular belief system or an ideology, this socialization process is very strong. We also have a natural tendency to conform to what other human beings want us to believe or how we want to think. And since we are a very groupish species, we tend to congregate with people that look like us and think like us and believe like us. Another thing that we have a tendency to get into, since we are a fairly groupish species, is the concept of groupthink. When we get into this, can happen more likely in small groups, but we do see it on large scale as well when people are caught up into these beliefs, into these ideologies. Well, groupthink is a collective faith for the group to rationalize what everybody already wants to do or the loyalty to that idea or the loyalty to the leader of that group. There's been some examples throughout history. The Bay of Pigs invasion was considered kind of a groupthink process. What led us to get into Vietnam, groupthink. The kind of single-minded effort to invade Iraq, in hindsight, that has been determined a fairly good example of groupthink. We also have a tendency to blame others for problems, the need for a politically accountable villain. The anti-vaccine beliefs are a good example of that. The idea got started with a very discredited article over 20 years ago, but the idea caught hold that child vaccinations were connected to autism, even though that one study that came out in 1998 was discredited immediately. The guy that put that study together was actually lost his medical researcher's license. It was a very biased study, discredited very early on, and there's been dozens and dozens of studies that have tried to establish that link that has not been established, but that belief still continues. And people, as a result of this belief, would refuse to have their child vaccinated because of that. And not just measles, but measles and other, such as whooping cough, are at their highest level in decades because of the less children that are being vaccinated because of this irrational belief that has caught hold and seems to gain traction amongst like-minded people who want to continue to believe that. Another thing that we have to watch out for is stereotyping. That's something that is also very natural for our brains to do. And that's taking a middle shortcut, putting people in broad categories. Yeah, I know that type of person, so therefore I can already kind of shape up what they are going to be like. Well, that is very unreliable because all human individuals are different. In class, since I am from Texas, I would throw out this exercise and have people give me their stereotypes of Texans. And interestingly enough, almost every single stereotype that they come up with, I don't fit those at all. Think of any stereotype of a Texan, and I don't fit that stereotype. So this is where they can become problematic if our system one thinking is relying on that. Another thing we tend to do is to reduce complexity. We don't like those gray areas. We are much more comfortable if there's a definite pattern or a structure to what's happening, particularly the binary dichotomous type of thinking of right versus wrong, left versus right, up versus down, in versus out, good versus evil. That's more natural to our brains and easier for us to put things into patterns that makes it less complicated for us. So that's another thing we have a tendency to do that we've got to watch out for. Very important in your paper topic is watching out for confirmation bias. That's if you've already got an idea that you think this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, so let me tell you what I think. That's not what your paper topic is about. You want to avoid that at all costs. Confirmation bias is just searching out those facts that support what you already think what you think you know, or what your belief already is, that this is right or that's wrong. So I'm going to just conveniently ignore those facts that are counter to my belief. Another thing that is natural to humans, and this is a human universal, that we all have a tendency to do because we are socialized into a culture by our parents, and that is the tendency to feel that your culture is superior to other cultures, and that's not necessarily an outward disdain for other cultures, but it's just kind of a natural tendency that we are more comfortable and we prefer our culture to other cultures, so that we tend to bias against other cultures the way they do things. So how and why do we study something, whether it's any field of social science? Here you want to find a topic that has to do with marriage, any aspect of marriage, any aspects of relationships, of families. We're wanting to learn how information is obtained. We want to find good information. We want to be able to interpret that information soundly, credibly, with valid methods. There is a danger, of course, in generalizing from your own personal experience. We cannot necessarily rely on that for scientific evidence. Now, anecdotal experience is useful in that it can be descriptive in explaining something that happened to you that's relevant to this topic. It could also, if a lot of people have those similar experiences, then that's useful because then we can see perhaps a trend that your experience is common to other people's experience. So there must be something to that we can look at a broader societal level. But you certainly do not want to base your entire paper on your own anecdotal experience. It's just use it as a supplement, if at all, in your description of your topic. Another thing that we have to be careful about is relying on what we think is common sense about something. Common sense is very useful in our world. That helps our intuition. It's learning how things work in the world, how to operate in the world. For example, if you travel a lot, you'll have a little bit more common sense on how to get through airports or how to navigate your way through strange territories. So that's useful. We have to be careful, though, in using common sense in order to analyze something scientifically, because we may gloss over or disguise errors in reasoning and fall back on assumptions of what we think of people, what they would normally do. So one of the things as to why we tend to discount science is because it may not necessarily explain everything. Science, by its very nature, is incremental, that we're trying to figure things out to the best of our ability with the tools that we have to be able to learn more. And then in some case, we may not figure it out. We may actually get it wrong. And so therefore, science is also a self-correcting process. The more we learn, the more we know, the better tools we have to try to figure something out and understand it and interpret it. So that's what is somewhat less than satisfying to a lot of people with science. So therefore, they would just continue to rely on their beliefs. But we've got to be careful about that if we want to learn how things work, why human beings do the things they do. Some more problems with our perceptions, particularly if we rely too much on certain forms of media. Now, we have to put some faith in our news media. We'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the course as far as legitimate, credible news media sources that you can also use to help describe your topic. But the entertainment media has to attract viewers, so they're not necessarily looking at reality from a scientific viewpoint. They often rely on distorted or stereotypical portrayals of people in their programming. Even when you look at a lot of these reality shows, they are looking at fairly unrealistic depictions, or the more dysfunctional the behavior, the more it's going to sell for a reality show. So certain extremes are highlighted, unrealistic depictions. Daytime talk shows are looking for those dysfunctional aspects. In the reality TV, much of that is just manufactured drama. Much of it is actually scripted, so it's not necessarily reality TV. Also, you have to be careful with advice gurus and self-help genres that can be particularly misleading because they are trying to generate money as a motivation for advice and self-help. So you've got to be careful. So what we have to rely on, this scientific method, when it really came into being during the Enlightenment period, around the early 1600s, with philosophers such as Francis Bacon and Descartes, that came up with a scientific method that then grew from there, that led to scientific discoveries, mathematics, physics, calculus, etc., biology, statistics, just on and on and on. It's incalculable how much that the use of the scientific method has improved our world just in the last 500 years. The scientific method, defined as the systematic, organized series of steps that assures maximum objectivity and consistency in researching a problem. And we would use a miniature version of the scientific method when we are analyzing our paper topic. We want to use legitimate, credible research that undergoes the peer review process that is published in academic journals. Those are going to be our primary sources for our scientific analysis of this topic. So despite how laborious the scientific method is, it's responsible for essentially all the gains in understanding the natural world. Cannot overemphasize how important this use of a scientific method has been. We've made enormous progress as a result of the use of a scientific method. The scientific method may involve a theory that has been developed over time. That's an idea or an assumption that attempts to explain or predict some phenomenon out in the world. We could actually develop theories through considerable observation of something that's happening out in the world. And after so much observation, we can start to gather some predictable theories. Or we can gather a lot of facts. We can collect data. And through the interpretation of those facts, we can come up with a theory that tries to explain or predict what certain phenomena is going on out in the world. You might have some theories that you would find in your research on your paper topic as far as certain behaviors in relationships or factors that influence breakups or divorces, whatever your topic is. Now, this is a very important question. What is it that makes a good, valid theory? I ask this question in class, and people will often say, well, that it can be proven. Well, actually, it's the opposite of that. What makes it a good theory, in fact, what makes it a theory in the first place, is that it's falsifiable. It can be disproven. Because if we can't disprove it, then you'd have to ask, well, what is it? If you can't disprove it, then it's apparently just somebody's belief, or perhaps some religious faith or doctrine, or some pseudoscience, such as astrology, which we can make up whatever we want. So this is a very important point, that a theory is a theory because it can be disproven. Otherwise, we really don't know what it might be, perhaps just some belief. An hypothesis is how we might test our theory by finding a relationship between at least two variables that can be tested or that can be measured. And then we can look at the effect or the relationship of one variable on that other variable. I'll give you an example here in a little bit. So we're looking at some independent variable x and how it influences the dependent variable y, such as what is the effect of education on your future income. Now, these are some theories that I won't necessarily ask you to memorize, but these are just some examples of theoretical perspectives on families. At the macro level, where we're looking at a system-wide or society-wide basis, there's theories such as the family ecology theory that looks at the importance of the environment that the family is in and how the family adapts to their environment. There's also structural functionalism, how the family serves the larger society. There's the conflict theory. This focuses on discord and competition between groups and how that influences relationships. The feminist perspective is looking at the influence of gender, and gender being a social construct and how the genders are relating to each other in these situations. At the micro level, this is looking at more of an individual, a personal level of communication and interaction between people, or maybe small groups of people. There's the symbolic interaction theory, behavior of individuals and how we interpret meanings of certain things. The social exchange theory, looking at costs versus benefits of what this behavior, what is going to benefit to me as opposed to what it costs. The cooperative versus competitive examinations. We've got a developmental theory, looking at pattern changes in stages over time. What is that family shifting into? What stage or what change is happening at this particular time? The family systems theory is looking at the interaction between related subsystems, whether it's step families or grandparents, cousins, aunts and uncles, extended kin. Now, as far as conducting research, this is not something that I would necessarily have you do for your paper topic because the research has already been done. That'll be something for perhaps a future class. What you'll be doing is looking at existing research through these peer-reviewed academic studies that have been published. I'll post a video on how to find those here very soon. But just for your information, we want to talk about what are some things that you would do as far as conducting research. One of those is the quantitative analysis. That's where you're looking at large amounts of information and data, and then you're interpreting that through statistics or running experiments of that particular amount of data. The qualitative side of research is where you're observing more so rather than collecting data, studying smaller groups or individuals, looking at them in their normal environments and how they're interacting, how they're behaving, trying to get a more detailed understanding of a specific topic, or using case studies where something has been looked at on a specific base. You perhaps studied a particular small community of very close-knit families, and then you look at other case studies and see what they may have in common. Secondary data analysis for your paper topic. This is looking at data that was originally collected by someone else or for some other purpose, and it's made available for your use in your own analysis. Now, the most primary source that we'll be using for your paper topic that I've already talked about is the peer-reviewed academic journals. And this is such an important aspect of your paper that I'm going to talk about so much, I'm actually putting it into my own acronym, PRAJ. So whenever I use the acronym PRAJ, you will know at this point that I'm talking about peer-reviewed academic journals. That's how important they are. Another useful source is government data, whether it's from the Census Bureau that puts out lots of information, Office of Management and Budget. These are just a few of many examples. Bureau of Economic Analysis, Congressional Budget Office, National Center of Education Statistics, many government agencies that put out data that, depending on your topic, you might be able to find some interesting data that you can look at to help explain your paper topic. And then there's the credible communication sources, the news media, most importantly, newspapers, news magazines. Documentaries, you have to be careful with those because most documentaries are made with a point of view already in mind. So you have to kind of balance that. If you find any particular source that may have a specific point of view, well, then you're going to want to find perhaps another source to balance that looks at it from the opposing point of view. That's why if you stick to legitimate, credible news sources, peer-reviewed journal sources, academic studies, just government data sources, then you won't go wrong. You won't even have to worry about that. This is what's going to take some practice looking these up, reading them. Some other types of research, survey research, where you can find questionnaires, surveys, interviews. This is done through random sampling, typically closed-ended questions so that you don't give people the opportunity to expound. You just want them to give fairly simple answers to questions. Surveys and polls are very useful sources that can be put in your paper topics paper there, because if you just are rambling about your topic and you say, oh yeah, most people think that this is what you shouldn't be doing, well, you got to be careful with that. What you'd rather do is find a survey or find a poll where people have actually been asked that, and then you've got some data that you can say, oh yeah, according to the Pew Research poll, 73% of people said that yes, they preferred that. So rather than just saying that off the top of your head, which is not really good for an analytical paper, what you'd want to do is find a credible survey or a poll that backs that up for you. So there's lots of stuff out there. Clinical research, looking at in-depth examinations of certain types of maladies, observational research, where you observe people in their natural habitats. And of course, you'd want to be unobtrusive as possible so that you wouldn't interfere with what their natural behavior would be. And then you would just observe that. This could be through structured activities, and then observe how people perform those, or just in naturalistic environments, taking into account that the subject could be aware that they're being observed, so they could be altering their behavior. The observer could also bring in their own biases, and we're looking at typically private activities there. As far as experimental research, I touched on this, where you'd have an independent variable and its effect on the dependent variables, such as the effect of education on income. And we know over time, yes, increased education does result in increased income over time. Control variables could be used for that, where you could control, for example, I just want to look at men, or I just want to look at women, or I just want to look at men in their 40s. Obviously, you'd want to control this fairly tightly, because if you're looking at retired people or children, that wouldn't even be relevant to your study. So you'd want to control your variables to a certain degree. And you'd have to perhaps explain there's uncontrollable variables that you're not accounting for. For example, one of the primary influences on your education is your parents, the socioeconomic strata that your parents have, that when you're born, that is the biggest indicator of when you would actually go to college in the first place. We've also got other uncontrollable variables, such as connections and family input, that sort of thing, that aren't necessarily being measured here when you're only looking at years of education and the amount of income. Another top popular way of experimental research is the before and after effect, or looking at a control group versus an experimental group, where the control group gets the placebo, the experimental group gets the actual drug, and then you look at the effects and compare them. So these are just some examples of research. Applied research is looking at more practical type of observations rather than theoretical. Data observations gathered for the purpose of solving a problem, or recommending a policy, or evaluating a program. So that wraps up Chapter 2. This is a fairly important chapter as far as preparing for your paper topic. You probably will want to refer back to this chapter more than once as you are reading about your paper topic and preparing your paper that's due at the end of the semester. Okay, so stay tuned for the discussion forum, and that'll wrap up this Chapter 2.